Under the first two Tsars of the new Romanov dynasty, Moscow began to reassert control over Russia and her people. Any nobleman who dared challenge central authority faced exile or the loss of his lands. In return for their loyalty, the nobles were soon awarded unprecedented control over the peasants who worked their fields. The chaotic time of troubles had opened a window for the peasants. For years, they walked away from lands, debts, and landlords. The exodus crippled farms across Russia and destroyed the nation's economy. Moscow's solution? Serfdom.
And what serfdom really is in the law code of 1649 is to give any landholder unlimited time to find and return a runaway peasant. And that is, from that point onwards, it's understood that a peasant on these estates is to be considered a serf.
Free Russians had been made serfs, slaves, the legal property of the nobles who owned the land. The new law bound peasants, their children, and their children's children to the fields for life. Serfdom, the enslavement of their own people, would haunt the empire and the Romanov dynasty until its demise. In the late 17th century, in the kingdom called Muscovy, two brothers sat on the throne of the Tsar. The brother Tsars, Ivan V and Peter I, ruled a far-flung empire of isolated villages, cities, and towns, a place where daily life had changed little since the Middle Ages.
In the 17th century, Muscovy was definitely stuck in a medieval time warp, and it seemed backward by any measures. Muscovite Russia had not experienced the Renaissance. It had not experienced the scientific revolution of the 17th century.
Born in a medieval environment, the young Tsar Peter was captivated by everything modern. Anything new, anything from the West, people, ideas, even clothes. In 1696, Peter's half-brother and co-Tsar, Ivan V, died. As Pyotr Alexeyevich Romanov assumed sole control of the Russian throne, he declared his lifelong goal:
to break the bonds of the inflexible customs of Muscovy and to lead this country toward a new day, which shall be better than this.
And for Peter, Russia's new day dawned not in the East, but in the West, in Europe. For Peter, one thing above all symbolized the new Russia he hoped to build: ships, warships, transports, merchant ships. As Tsar, Peter would build his fascination into a navy, a force that would change Russia and the world.
Peter had a passion for all sorts of knowledge, but shipbuilding from a young age was something that just fascinated him. And he learned everything he could possibly learn about shipbuilding.
But as a potential maritime power, Peter's kingdom had one crippling drawback. Russia, the largest nation on Earth, was practically landlocked. In the north, Sweden and Poland held the Baltic coast. In the south, the Ottoman Empire encircled the Black Sea. Peter wanted a seaport for Russia, a window on the world and the West.
He wanted to take Russia out of its Muscovite isolation and backwardness and communicate with the West, communicate with them in terms of technology, in terms of ideas, in terms of exchanging goods. And for that, he needed warm water ports.
A taste of naval power had at last won Russia a port on the Black Sea. But Peter wanted more. He wanted the secrets of the high-tech warships of the great Western navies. And so the Tsar of Russia left his kingdom to seek out the know-how he craved. No Tsar had ever before set foot outside the kingdom. No Tsar had ever even seen Europe. Peter was going to shatter tradition. The winter of 1697, Peter and some 200 nobles, craftsmen, musicians, servants, and a troop of dwarves headed west on a year-and-a-half-long European road trip. To escape the tedious burdens of royalty, the Tsar himself often masqueraded as a common sailor. Peter's greatest hunger was for nautical science. In Holland's finest shipyard, he apprenticed himself to a master shipwright. Then Russia's carpenter Tsar learned how to build a 28-gun frigate from the keel up. But even with a Dutch ship of the line to his credit, Peter wasn't satisfied. The British ruled the seas, so the Tsar headed for England. July 1698, after 16 months on the road, Peter's entourage was partying in Vienna when an urgent message arrived from Moscow. Emboldened by Tsar Peter's extended absence, reactionary Streltsy regiments were stirring up revolt yet again. Peter's European apprenticeship ended abruptly. The jack-of-all-trades Tsar headed home to assert himself as Russia's unquestioned taskmaster. For 16 months, Tsar Peter I had reveled in the shipyards and palaces of Western Europe. When he returned home in 1698 and compared his realm with the West, Russia's supreme autocrat wasn't happy. His capital, Moscow, struck Peter as primitive and gloomy. Russia's nobility, the boyars, seemed medieval in their long beards and kaftans. The Orthodox Church wielded far too much power at the Tsar's expense. And to top it off, the Streltsy, the army's die-hard conservative musketeers, were in open revolt. Peter resolved to change it all. He dreamed of a new nation, a westernized Russia, an empire inspired by and wedded to Europe, a gilded land of order, progress, and power. He started his revolution with a little barbering.
He was known to rip people's beards right out with his bare hands at the roots, and beards to him were just something that said old barbaric way. It was a tangible way of dragging the nation forward.
The Tsar ordered a complete change of clothes for his noblemen. Boyars caught in the traditional long kaftans of Muscovy had their robes cut short on the spot.
What he's saying to the Russians, certainly to the Russian nobility, is you can't be very Russian anymore. You have to be Europeans. You have to re-educate yourself to act out the life of European gentlemen and gentlewomen.
Peter ruffled feathers all over the place. I mean, what he was proposing radical changes. He wanted to drag Russia literally out of the Dark Ages, kicking and screaming, with the force of his own will.
One obsession would shape Peter's entire reign: to create a Russian port on the Baltic coast, a window that would open Peter's kingdom to the world. But in 1700, the Baltic coast belonged to another nation and another bold young king, Charles XII of Sweden. Convinced that Russia was a paper tiger, Charles turned west to attack Poland. He would save Tsar Peter for later.
What Narva did to Peter is to convince him that all of the resources of the vast country which was under his control had to be put to serve one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to build Russia into a military power.
Peter seized bells from Russia's churches and melted them down to make cannon. He jacked up taxes to pay for a military buildup. He drafted 45,000 new troops from Russia's peasant families.
The term of service in the Russian army when people are drafted is 25 years. It's considered a death sentence. And when peasants leave the village to go into the army, they're given essentially a wake. They're treated as though they had died and that they're not coming back.
While Charles and the Swedes were distracted in Poland, Peter's army marched for the sea. By 1703, the Russians had carved out a beachhead on the Baltic, along the shores of the Gulf of Finland. On a boggy island where the river Neva meets the Gulf, Peter the Great staked his claim.
By nature, we are fated here to cut a window through to Europe. Here shall be a town.
May 1703, the Tsar grabbed an axe and began to build the city he christened Sankt Petersburg. Never a patient man, Peter wanted his new town to rise as fast as possible. He built his own log house in just 3 days. Peter knew Charles and the Swedes would return and try to force Russia out of the Baltic. He wanted fortresses and fighting ships ready to hurl them back. He wanted a city that Russia would never surrender. He ordered it all built, whatever the cost. Peter drafted thousands of workers to build his new city. Peasants, soldiers, even Swedish prisoners. Often without tools, they dug with their hands. In summer, malaria and mud crippled the work. In winter, ice and scurvy took their toll. Laborers died by the thousands. The Russians would say St. Petersburg was built on bones. More than a new city, St. Petersburg was the foundation of a new society. To dramatize the transformation of his realm, Peter would erect a gilded showcase just outside the city, Peterhof. With his new summer palace, the Russian Tsar sought to outdo even the glories of Versailles. Peter's goals, his new city, his new nation, were more important than any Russian life. He uprooted his entire court and commanded them to build new homes in his window on the west. He even told them how and where to build. When Sweden's King Charles heard of Peter's mad rush to build, he scoffed.
Let the Tsar tire himself out with founding new towns. We will keep for ourselves the honor of taking them later.
Peter waited for spring, then sent his rebuilt army, 60,000 strong, to confront Charles's invaders. In July, the Tsar and the King of Sweden faced off outside the Ukrainian town of Poltava. Crippled from wounds, Charles had to be carried onto the battlefield. But even outnumbered nearly 3 to 1, Sweden's warrior king still ordered his troops to attack. Sweden's first wave hurled the Russians back. Then Peter's artillery opened fire. Russian guns riddled Charles's troops. Russian conscripts drove them back. Peter's new army was simply too big and too well armed. On the killing fields of Poltava, King Charles's reign of glory was drowned in blood and dust. Russia's absolute ruler, Tsar Pyotr Alexeyevich Romanov, would become the new master of the Baltic. Russia was at last a great European power. In 1711, Tsar Peter the Great moved Russia's capital to his triumphant city on the Baltic, St. Petersburg. There was just one problem. The Russian people still considered Moscow the capital. But Peter never let public opinion interfere with his grandiose plans. Peter lived life non-stop. He often traveled over 100 miles a day, in an age when most people might never travel that far in a lifetime. The list of his innovations and reforms seems endless. The first Russian newspaper, the first hospital, the first museum, schools for navigation, geography, mathematics, politics, and astronomy, a new navy, a new army, a new capital. On a cold November day in 1724, Peter spotted a vessel foundering in the Baltic. Hands on to the very end, Peter waded into the freezing waters to save the sailors. Soon after, the Tsar fell sick. As he lay dying in January of 1725, Peter took pen and paper and prepared to write his will. In a single generation, Peter the Great had remade Russia. He had transformed his ancient land from an isolated kingdom into a modern global power, the goal a headstrong young man had set some 30 years before. Now, on the brink of death, one last task remained. Peter still had to name an heir to his empire. Yet of 15 children by 2 wives, only 2 daughters survived. On a piece of paper he wrote, "Give it all to..." He died without finishing the sentence, without naming an heir. The giant of the Romanov dynasty had stumbled. and left the greatest empire on earth without a ruler. Winter and doubt gripped Russia. Spring could be foretold, but Russia's future was unknown.